All right, so we're going to talk about ASP.NET Core on Azure. Who's currently using ASP.NET Core right now? All right, it's about half the room. Who's using it in production? How is that more hands went up in production? Okay. Who's using it on Azure? All right, that's great. Who's having problems on Azure? Who's lying? Okay. So what I want to cover today is kind of how to get started, the many ways we can publish, some performance things, maybe some security things. There might be some stuff that you know, there might be some stuff you don't know, and how to tackle some of this. So I guess a lot about this talk is going to be kind of taking a rock and skipping it across the lake when it comes to using ASP.NET on Azure. And feel free to ask questions as we're going through this. I want this to be more of a conversation than it is me talking. Because a lot of this, there might be some things where you're like, hey, I didn't even know you could do that. And it'll make it a little bit more fun for you and a little more fun for me. So my name is Shayne Boyer. I'm from Florida, so it's still yesterday or just got today here. And I'm a cloud developer advocate for Azure. And what that means is I'm here to hear why you are having problems on Azure, so I can turn around and tell the product teams and engineering teams what's going on and why you can't do certain things on Azure and get those things fixed for you. So really I'm more of an advocate for you than for the cloud, if that makes sense. So let's talk about ASP.NET Core on Azure. And when you're thinking about this, it's really just a web application and hosting, right? Right, we're just putting a web out there, a web app on Azure. I hear somebody snicker because that's what I thought too. When you really think about it, ASP.NET on Azure is more like this. It's a web app, and it's where to put it and how to put it. And you think about all the services that we could use when it comes to using a web application on Azure. There's analytics. There is this thing called Kudu. Does anybody know what Kudu is? A couple of people. Glenn, you don't count? It's how do I package my app and put it out there. There's Docker. It's ASP.NET Core cross-platform. So do I use Docker? Do I put it on Linux? Do I put it on web apps? Do I put it in Kubernetes? Do I put it on ACS or AKS or the 5 other acronyms that we have out there in order to put on Azure? There's measuring the performance and things like that. So it's more than just a web application that we're putting into the cloud on somebody else's server to host it. Interesting, let's look at the portal real quick before we get into some of this stuff. I don't know how long some of you have been using the portal. This might give you a little bit of sneak peek. This is what the portal looked like when I started using Azure. Does anybody use the portal when it was this old? Okay, so this is 2010, and this is when the portal was built in Silverlight, and we had about 5 services. Okay, and we had hosted services, storage accounts, CDN, and then we also had SQL Server, which was actually another portal that you had to go to still. In 2012, we jumped to HTML5, and this is what the portal looked like. This is actually my favorite portal because it was really easy to find stuff because that was all the services that we had. So when I wanted to go create a new website, I clicked on the website button. It was nice and easy to do. After that, we had to get into this thing called DevOps, and it switched into this slide-out menu from the left, which was really fun because it was HTML5 and it was animated. And we started getting these Windows 10 tiles, and we started introducing some of this. And then eventually, what it looks like today. This is probably what most of you are dealing with there. But then we also have this other thing called the CLI. Who uses the Azure CLI? 2 people, 3 people? Don't be afraid. I use the CLI every day. It's a lot of fun. So anyway, let's talk about publishing your application. There is only one way to do publishing of your application. It's right-click deploy, right? Right? No. If my friend Damien was here, he would probably throw something at me. All right. So our options for publishing our ASP.NET Core apps obviously is Visual Studio deployment. Yes, it is right-click deploy, and I would duck if Damien was here, but he's not. He's not going to be here until tomorrow. He's our DevOps guy. We do have that option to right-click our project and do a deployment. We'll go through that and what that looks like. And sometimes that is the best way to get started and understand how we get our apps into App Service. We have the ability to publish the apps, create the app service, create our resource groups, and push our apps and have that compile and deploy there. And also configure our environment variables, and I'll walk through a demo of what that looks like. The other option is some of our app service capabilities. We have a GitHub CI/CD integration. Is anybody using that now? No? Does anybody know we can do that? Yeah, cool, all right. And there's also built-in Git. So when we create an application, an app in App Service, we actually have built-in Git integration. We build a Git endpoint for you that you can actually integrate and push your code to, and we'll do the builds right in App Service and deploy that too. The other option is App Service for Linux. So if you're running Docker containers and you're building your apps that way and pushing those out to Docker Hub or Azure Container Registry or your private registry, you can actually run your apps in App Service for Linux and pull your .NET Core apps from that registry and run them right inside of App Service. And then finally, what was previously known as VSTS, now renamed to Azure DevOps, we can create those pipelines and run that through what that looks like. So real quick, let's see what some of these options look like. And while I'm firing up good old Windows on my Mac, one of the things that I will show you too, has anybody heard of, while that's firing up, let's look at our GitHub deployment. So if I'm in the Azure portal, and I made a nice little NDC Sydney application. So this is just a web application that I've created in Azure, and pretty simple. We just did add a new resource and chose web app here. So that's how we did that and created that. So I'll get out of that, go home. And I want to go ahead and add this into GitHub integration. So what I can do is go down to, as it loads, we have our deployment options. Why is it asking me to do deployment credentials? We don't want that. There we go, deployment options. We have the ability to choose a source. Now, I mentioned we have GitHub, but we can also use Bitbucket as well. So I choose GitHub. And here now it's going to, I've already used my, set up my credentials for my actual GitHub account. So now it's going to actually reach out to GitHub and see the actual the repos that I have access to and pull those in real quick. Real quick is relative, depending on your internet connection. I have access to a lot of repos. And what we'll do is we'll choose the actual repo that we have access to. Here we go. Thank you very much. Choose your organization. I have my personal account, then also my Microsoft account and other orgs that I have access to. So I won't change that because that will take some time. I'll choose a project. And I was nice enough to set up NDC Sydney. And then you can choose your branch. So I could set up multiple app services and then choose a specific branch. If I had a dev branch, I could choose that one for a different instance. But in this case, obviously just master. And I hit OK. Now what that's going to do is set up my deployment source. And what it'll do is go out and reach and do a git pull into this particular app. And then run a compilation. It uses Kudu, which is the compiling system behind this and actually do a pull of that. So let me go back and hit deployment options now. So now it's going to show here. Awesome, we had failures. An unknown. This is, I didn't script this, but when stuff goes wrong, that's part of my slides. Okay, so now we actually get to figure out what happens. Not cool. So what I do is I click the redeploy. Try again. Most likely this is an internet connection problem, more than anything else. So we'll go back and hit deployment options. Wait, sync again. Yes, go. So again, it'll pull it in, do our builds, and do a deployment. And it says, hey, I successfully resubmitted. So we've got a redeployment in process here, which is great. That was not planned, but I appreciate whoever's downloading Windows or something, setting that up for us. Actually, there we go. You know, it was funny. It was cached because it was pulling the wrong repo. So that was one of my tests. So that was, maybe I did it to myself. Awesome. So while that's doing that, let's go over and look at right-click deploy. Do not look at my password. We'll fire that guy up. All right. So, this particular project, I know everybody's using Visual Studio. Is anybody using VS Code or another editor? All right, let me ask the question. VS Code, who's using that? That is awesome. You guys are using all VS Code for, that's fantastic. That makes me so happy. Who's using VS Code not on Windows? That's awesome. You're all my friends now. And not that I don't like Windows. I like to see that we're using it cross-platform. Okay. So this is obviously Visual Studio. The project that I have here that I'll try and do some fancy like zooming thing that I can never figure out. There we go. Look at that. This is a conference planner app, and if you go and look at a GitHub repo, it's under .NET-presentations. Called Conference Planner. This is a workshop that we give here. We gave it this weekend. Was it this weekend? 2 days ago. That basically is a front end, is a back end, and a Razor Pages app. It's a full ASP.NET Core application. And what I want to do is be able to deploy this to Azure. And the easy way to do that is we'll just right click and do publish, which is in here. Here it is. It's one of the reasons why I don't like to do it, because it's really hard to find. And what we can do is choose our publish here. I've got it set up already, obviously as a profile that I've set up. I can say new profile. I can select an existing because I already have it existing up there in Azure. I can hit publish. We're going to choose our subscription. It's going to load our subscriptions while we have those up there, and our resource group. But we'll let that load real quick. And then after we choose our resource group and the actual app that's established up there, if we didn't have one established, we can say create new one, and it'll create that app service for us as well. But one of the options that I want to show here is that if we have environment variables, we can pre-select those as well as an option for pushing this up to the cloud. And our internet connection is killing me right now. So, but that is the challenge of doing this here. So, we don't want to cancel. We want to wait. Maybe you want to cancel. All right. We'll cancel that. So if I hit edit app settings, the app settings, what this will do is when you're looking at your application settings that you normally would have in your app settings file, it'll read that out of your app settings.json file, put those in this here, and then you can be able to publish those into your environment variables that exist in Azure. If you already have this published in Azure, it'll read those out of the environment variables that you have in your app service, and you're able to edit and change those things. And those can be anything from what your development what your environment styles will be, development or production, obviously, connection strings, any other special variables that you might want to manage. So there's all of mine. Don't copy them. Okay. So there's my application insights that you can't see really well. So we've got application insights, instrumentation key. We've got the URLs that we're going to be listening on. And I've got some other kind of default versions and stuff in here. Here we go. I don't know if that's a little easier to see what we've got there. So these are all of the environment variables that I have in my app service, which I can show when we go back to the portal. But I'm able to manage these and add more to them. And then when I hit apply, when I do the publish, it'll go ahead and update those as well. So that's another option to do that. Now the downside, if you will, is if you have a solution that has multiple applications in it, I've got to right-click publish for each one of those and make sure that my settings are all in line and stuff like that. And that's where the right-click publish model kind of falls down if you're doing big applications that have multiple parts to them and making that all set up. So we had a failure on our GitHub. I'm sure it's my fault. But what's cool about this is we can view the logs and figure out why. Maybe it's because I set it up as a Linux deployment or something. So we click view log on our deployments. We're able to figure out what the problem is and go from there and fix that. And it could be various reasons. Oh, yeah, because I live on the edge. Targeting 2.2. All right. But we can figure out how to fix that. I can put in a global JSON file and fix that. Okay. The other option, what was our other option that we had in there? Oh, app service for Linux and containers. So I need to grab my container name out of that, and we'll go back home. So one of the other options we have for hosting this is the containers. Anybody using containers right now for stuff? It's okay, don't be afraid. Nice and high. So I use containers for almost all of my applications, and there's a number of reasons why. I know that when I put my .NET apps in a container, I run it on my machine, I put it in Azure, I put it on Bob's machine or Sarah's machine, it's going to be exactly the same. That's one benefit for me. And also I get some scaling and other things that are easier to do when it comes to containers. But the other benefit is I publish my .NET Core apps to Azure, or to Azure Container Registry, or to Docker Hub, or private registry. I'm able to pull those onto my machine, but also pull them into App Service for Linux here. So when I go to create a new web app in Azure, oh, there it is, web app right here, and we'll say my NDC test. And I choose Docker, and we'll just say we want to use an existing resource. I think I have NDC set up here. I do. And my app service plan, I probably have one set up already. I do in Australia East. There's a new option here called Configure Container. And it asks me where do I want to pull my image from. And I have a test image here, just called ASP.NET App. And I hit OK. And then hit Create. And what that's going to do is create an app service for us, and then go and pull that Docker image from wherever we've got it. We've happened to pull an example app here and pull it down and create our app service for us. So you'll see it's got a deployment in progress to that resource group. And it'll tell us when it's ready. And it shouldn't take too long to do that. Famous last words. But in the meantime, I can show you this one, which I set up. If I go into, oh, look at that. We'll pin that. It says it's already done. So let's go to that one. So my NDC test. Again, it's just a regular app service. It's running on Linux. It supports a Docker container. I said to go pull that image from Docker Hub as an example. And it should give us a URL here in a second. There it is. So I'm going to launch that app. And it should fire up here by pulling that Docker image and launching it for us on port 80. And it could be any .NET container. And this happens to be a 2.1 image. There's a .NET Core, ASP.NET Core 2.1. Now call it a downfall. This is actually pulling the image on first request. So whoever hits your image, whoever hits your website first is going to pay that price. So when you're doing development like this and you're deploying, you may consider kind of pre-warming your app with some sort of test or initial test or things like that. Also keep in mind that the size of your image will matter too, and the proximity to where your app service is. So here it's pulling it from Docker Hub to Australia East. I don't know where Docker Hub exists as far as their registry is concerned. So it could be in Chicago, it could be in California, it could be somewhere like that. If I had an Azure container registry that was in the same location that I was deploying my app to, that proximity is much closer, so it would take less time to pull that image. I believe that my NDC one is going to be closer for us. So if I ran that one, you see it's still pulling the image where it's got my untitled. This one I believe is already pulled, and it's ready to go. This one is still pulling that image. And that image is not that big. It's only about maybe 130 megs. It's not a lot to pull, but wherever that's pulling it from Docker Hub is taking some time. So those are the three initial ways to launch and push our apps to app service when it comes to publishing applications. Let's go back to PowerPoint. The last one is DevOps pipelines. So if we look at that workshop code, that workshop application, this is my dashboard for that application. And I've got, if you look at the resources on the top left here, we've got the big app service. This one's actually running in Linux. I've got a SQL three SQL servers running, front end app service, a back end app service. I've got multiple application insights running. There's also Docker stuff happening all in this workshop. There's a whole lot of schmutz going on in this thing. All .NET Core, but it all gets published by a VSTS or Azure DevOps using that code I showed you in Visual Studio. And that all works using pipelines. So the code is actually hosted in GitHub. If I look at that code there. So this is the actual code. It runs in GitHub. We've got the source here that pulls it all up. And all we're doing here is very similar to how we did the Git integration with App Service, is we're getting the sources from GitHub using credentials. We're telling it to use .NET Core 2.1.4.01 as the SDK, doing a .NET Restore, a build, publish that back end, and that publish is not actually publishing it to Azure, it's doing the .NET publish, And then we're publishing some artifacts front end and back end. And what these do is these create actual artifacts that we can now publish using releases. So if I go into a release pipeline and we look at what that looks like, this here takes the artifacts that are created from our pipeline and then pushes these over to Azure using the release pipeline once they're available. And that pushes all that stuff over into the workshop that runs right on Azure. So if I looked at these app services, if I looked at the front end, this is a regular app service. It gets deployed from that pipeline. And you can see all the traffic that's going on. A lot of fun. My mouse is not working. Come on. There we go. We look at that application, and we're getting some errors. Good, because we'll look at those later on. This is great. So if I go back to the pipeline, and we look at our builds, look at the actual build here, and we look at edit. One of the other things that's important to mention is that pipeline doesn't do just the front end and back end. We also have in the workshop other parts of that app. So since we're teaching a workshop, there's save points and start over points that we're going through and building each one of these things and making sure that they build and publish. So there's save points in each one of these pieces. But then we're also creating Docker images that we're publishing to Azure. We're actually creating an Angular front end for the back end and also building that and publishing it to App Service. So pipelines is a very powerful point and probably our best practices when we're talking about publishing .NET apps or any platform apps to Azure, be able to run tests. Tests we don't have built into this, but there's that capability. So looking at the progression of how you could start with maybe a right-click deploy, make sure that works in App Service, and then there's even the ability to create those pipelines from Visual Studio, if that's your tool of choice, to kick off this process using VSTS as well. There is the ability in Azure to create the DevOps pipelines. As it searches. Not liking that. I don't want to search Marketplace. Oh, here's our DevOps project. So you can create the DevOps project here, select the .NET project, and that will create that DevOps pipeline that I just showed. Not that exact one, but a framework for doing that, pulling it from Git or from Bitbucket or even your own repository of choice built in. To build that and publish it to Azure. So that's also a capability too. All right. Okay. So, troubleshooting. My favorite screen that comes up. Service is unavailable. We've already seen some failures already. One of the scenarios that actually came up with this workshop, not the one we saw, was I was trying to publish the app using the DevOps pipeline, and I kept getting an error, and I didn't know why. And I think this is probably, by show of hands, one of the most frustrating things when it comes to publishing an app. Is when stuff breaks or when it doesn't start. This is good old error 500 or 502s or 503s, and it doesn't matter if I'm publishing it to Azure, to my local machine, or to some other provider, and I can't get it to render. But I figured it's fine. It's just a web app. There's got to be a way to fix it. But typically, I can look at my Chrome tools. I can look at any developer tools. Something's going to tell me. Most of the time, there's no output. Something's happening on the server, and it's how do we get to fixing those things. I think it's probably one of the #1 frustrating things, at least for me, when it comes to trying to figure out how stuff works. So how do we do that? What are some of the ways that we can go and figure that out? Let's go into the portal. So if I'm in the portal and I go look at our front end, because I believe this gave us an error, right? Look at that, internal server error. Just by coincidence, the app we're talking about gave us an error. So one of the things that we can do is I can go into the application settings when it loads. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my environment to development. That's the first thing that I do. And what that will do is turn on the developer exception pages. Because you know, when I run this on my machine, it works. Right? I hit F5 or do .NET run, and the thing works on my machine. So nothing's wrong. It's not my code. I already have that set up. So if this was production, we wouldn't get this information. That's what this is. This is the developer pages, and it's telling us what's going on. If it was set to production, you just get the service unavailable. Have a nice day. By turning on developer pages, the development environment, you're going to get these pages here to tell us what's going on. So we can inspect our cookies, the headers, see what's going on, and figure out, at least give us a little bit more information. So that's usually my first mode of attack, is to try and look at this stuff and see what's going on. And in this case, it looks like it can't connect to the backend server. So we can figure what that is. And most likely, it doesn't have, looks like maybe this service URL is probably incorrect. Something like that's going on. So we could look at that, see if that's available. And that looks fine. Everything is good there. So who knows what that problem is? We figure that out. So the next thing that you could do is open good old Kudu. We go down to Advanced Tools. And I just happen to know where it is on the left side. This is kind of a daunting list. But you can look in, you can search for Kudu. And it just knows that it's in Advanced Tools. I can click Advanced Tools. I did click it. Is it loading? There we go. And then hit Go. And what this will do is open up a new kind of console that gives us a little more access to what's going on. So we'll wait this to come up. And log in and do authentication. And here we'll get some of the same information that we saw in the development page. So I can look at environment, and we can kind of see if I can make this bigger. All right. We can see the actual system info, what's going on, what machine it's running on. Here's our app settings that's here. Some connection string information. Looks like there's some SQL Express info that we probably don't need. So we can take that out of the app. All of the environment variables that are set, which are a ton. So we can look at all this information and see if there's anything that's going on. When it comes to service unavailable, one of the things that I like to do that you may not know is available is I go to the debug console and I hit command. If you're running on Linux, it'll actually give you a bash option. And I might have to reduce this down. No, I don't. Okay. So now at this point, I'm actually browsing the site contents itself. So I can look at where the site is, go to dev.root, and here's my actual app that's here. And I happen to know that this is front end. You can do .NET and do front end .dll. And let's actually try and start your application here. And what's interesting is it runs. But you'll notice in this particular instance, it's listening on port 5000. So I might not have set up my ports right. So if you're familiar with how the web host builder works in ASP.NET Core, there is the use URLs in the actual code, and you can specify what port to listen on. I happen to know this code pretty well, that we have use URLs 5000 in it, or I believe it's 5069 and 5000. This is an error that I chased for a long time. I was like, oh crap, I left that code in there. I didn't set my environment variable. There's actually an environment variable that you can set that will override as far as your config. So I probably didn't set that up. So I can now go into my app settings and set that URL to make sure I'm listening on port 80 and on port 443. So that's why we're getting that error here. But this is a good way to figure out what is going wrong. If you're connecting to a database and your authentication is wrong, you're going to get all those kind of console log errors that you would normally get when you do .NET Run on your local machine. You see all that output. This will at least give you a little bit more information that you're not going to see piped out to the browser, because it never happens. It never makes that connection. This is a nice little trick. So I'm going to keep that in the back of your head. Best way to get out of that is just hit environment. Go back home. Hands up on who knew you could do this. Hit a couple. This was a gem. I don't know what to do. I'm like, I'm going to try this. I'm like, look at that. I forgot to set my environment variable. So that's a good little, thing to have. I've now been able to kind of pass it on. People are like, hey, man, my credentials were wrong to my Redis cache. And it shows up in there because it was trying to do that. And I forgot to set environment variable. So neat little thing. The other thing you can do in here that is also probably going to scare some people is, I say scare in a good way, you can actually edit files in here too. There's this little pencil. So I can edit things in here, like the service URL. So like debug live or edit in production. Quick fix, boss is standing over your shoulder. Like, no, they're not here to do the build. They're not here to do the publish. Like, okay, hang on. I'll fix it for you. So yeah, you can do that too. That would have been really helpful back in the day when we had to deal with that file all the time. Good old web config, because nobody's messed one of those up before. So yeah, you can do that too. All right. Let's see what we got next. Let's go back to here. All right, like a little friend in the corner. It's fine. We can fix it. No worries. All right, security. Hiding secret stuff. I've shown some application settings and how you can do that. When you're doing configuration in your apps, on your local machine, in your local dev, there is user secrets that you're doing. We're doing user secrets, obviously, so you don't accidentally push that stuff to GitHub. So you're only doing that locally on your machine. You can do appsettings.json. You can check that stuff in. It's going to be available to whoever's doing that. So don't do that. Use your environment, so appsettings.development.json, and we'll do that too. You can do all of your configuration settings there for doing your keys if you're doing Twitter auth or Facebook auth type of things. The thing to understand is that environment variables win. So you can do all that stuff in your development. If you have the same key, like here we have hosting environment as an app setting, if you're keying off of that locally in your machine, and then you publish this to Azure and set that environment variable, this is going to win. So web host builder has a setup on how that works. I've got a link at the end of the presentation that talks about how all the different all the different environment variables that Web Host Builder looks at. But environment variables win as far as how the configuration works. So use environment variables. Environment variables you can set by slots. So if you have a slot for staging or production or kind of a dark light things, you can set those up that you have one value for each, and when you swap them, they'll switch with those two. The other option you have is Key Vault. Is anybody using Key Vault? No? Yes, a couple. So Key Vault works differently in the sense that application settings are specific to the app service itself and or the slot, where Key Vault is a little more secure, but also it's global, meaning that we can use the keys, the settings, not only in the app service because it's got an SDK that you can call and implement via your app, but you can use it for other things. So if you have a mobile app or I don't know, desktop application, you can share keys amongst all those. And then they're also globally managed. So if you have somebody who's responsible for managing keys, they can make a change in Key Vault, and then it'll flow through any of the apps that access that. So you can use Key Vault as an option too. All right. Performance in testing your application within Azure. One of the things that I've been messing with recently, everybody uses Fiddler, right? Yeah, the greatest tool ever existed is Fiddler when it comes to testing your apps. And I don't mean just watching the URLs flow through as you're clicking them. So one of the things that you can do is actually use Fiddler to, kind of click through your app and be able to select URLs in Fiddler and then export that as a web test file. And then we can use that within Azure to run performance tests and then collect that data through application insights, which is really cool because then we can see where stuff fails. And I'll show you how that's done here in a second. You can also do performance tests within App Service. So within your actual app, you can test specific endpoints and set up, emulate 5, 10, 100 users over 5 minutes. And be able to set that up on an interval so that we're kind of just doing ping tests within App Service. And that's the endpoint testing too. The good thing about that is when it comes to kind of paying for stuff in Azure, there's no data going in or out of Azure. It all exists inside of Azure, so it's almost free, right, when it comes to that. You only kind of pay for the stuff that goes inside and outside of the boundaries. The one thing to note about App Insights, for those of you who live in East Australia, it's not here yet, but I looked at a thing earlier today that Q1, is it Q1? Q1 is supposed to be here in East Australia, Application Insights. So use it now for testing, but it should be here. According to the roadmap that I saw, which I think I have up here.
Is it FYQ1?
Mm-hmm. Here, look at that. Insights. Yes, Australia East, Q1 2019, GA. So I did check it before I said that. Doesn't mean that date's going to move or not going to move. I just, as of right now, this moment, it's there. So Application Insights. So how does that look? Let's see what that looks like here. Actually, let me go back to the slides because I got some things that we'll show here first. And then we'll go through that things. So why is Application Insights cool? There's really no code setup when it comes to it, right? When you create an app service, there's actually a checkbox that says Enable App Insights. Yes. Always click that button. Yes. Because when stuff breaks, this is another thing that will help you when it comes to that. There's a live metric stream, there's an application map, there's custom analytics, there's all kinds of query fun things that you'll get lost in for days on like, I had no idea this was there. If you watch the ASP.NET community stand-up, go on YouTube or just kind of, Bing with Google or Google with Bing or whatever you use, DuckDuckGo. There is a really good episode when Damien Edwards was doing the actual website for that. He went through an entire walkthrough on all of the stuff that he's done for that site with App Insights. And he kind of does a really big deep dive on some of the things that he had been learning on what it can show. That is no longer relevant. Ignore that slide. Here's an example of an application map. I'll show one as well. But this is kind of, when I click an application map, this shows everything that's relative to a specific app. It shows availability, the storage, it monitors the HTTP dependencies, it monitors SQL dependencies. So if you connect to a SQL server, you can dive in and see all the calls that happen in between SQL Server and your app. It has custom performance charts, and this is when I was saying it's going to get kind of blurry. It'll show you which pages have been slow. It'll show how many external calls have you been making. It'll actually monitor how your page traffic has changed over time. I actually got an email this morning that I have downstream dependencies on my blog that have gotten slower over the last week. It happens to be Discus. I don't care about comments. They're slow. But I'll get those emails saying, hey, there's been some degrading performance in areas of your application. Is there script errors occurring? If you've got JavaScript in your apps, or you've got includes and things like that in your apps, are those going bad? You can actually click on these things and deep dive into any one of those areas. When stuff goes bad, analyzing failures. So again, this is here's an exception type. We've got a format exception, error 500s. Boy, that'd be nice to have a couple of minutes ago. Here's an Azure table storage dependency failures that we can look into. And then as we click into that format exception, we get all the way down into the code and says an input string was not in the right format. And it kind of gives us what was the user ID, the session ID, what country was it, client IP addresses. This is why it's important. It has to be in your region. I think that's as far as collection stuff. We can show telemetry for that specific things. And then you can also set up alerts for specific types of errors and watch them. So I've corrected an error, I've pushed a code, but now I can set up alert. You probably don't want to set up an alert for input string or something, because it probably happens a lot, or date formats. But as there's certain errors in your application, you can set up for that. If you're tracking errors in VSTS as work items, you can actually mark and set this as a work item and assign it to Sarah. Hey Sarah, there's a problem in the app. Here's the line of code that happens. You can get down to that level and publish that into VSTS. So let's look at a couple of those things real quick. Let's get out of here. Let's see if it'll let me run Fiddler. You can run Fiddler on a Mac with mono, but we're not going to do that today. I'm not responsible for anything that comes up in tiles when it comes up. Funky pictures, people do things. No, I don't want to learn more. Okay. They are a sponsor, but I didn't plan that. Okay, so let's clear this out, remove all. So I can go and browse. Can't browse to the app I had because that was not working. But we'll just show an example. So what did we have? Was it NDC Sydney-Linux or something like that? All right, Sydney-Linux.Azure websites. Come on, keystrokes, go. .NET. So you can see on the left how it's starting to log all that, and we'll just clear this out. Clear, Shayne. Remove all. And I think we can do this, and then we can do this. Nice. Yes, go. All right. So as I'm clicking around the app, let me say accept, and just logging it like you normally would when it comes to Fiddler type of stuff. We don't want to click any of these other things. At home, I'm just doing some fun things here. What I can do now is I can select these in Fiddler, and I don't want this one. Select the ones you want, and then we can say File, Export Selected Sessions, and it has options. In our options that we have, the one that we want is Visual Studio Web Test, and then we would just save that as a web test file. And then in an Azure, when we're in Azure, we go over here. Bless you. And we're going to go home. And we're going to go to our good old NDC Sydney guy. This one here. And then inside of your app service, you can go down to, I believe it's called Performance Test. And what we're going to do is add a new one. And there's some options. You can generate the load test from a certain area. You can select a user load, like how many users do you want to pound your site with. We could hit run test. We can do one URL, which is just a manual test. Or we can say we want a web test. And that's where we go and select that file. I happen to have one for my other one that's obviously not gonna work here. But this is gonna run through the scenarios that you click through in that order for the amount of users and for that duration against your site. And if you have application insights running on your app, you can actually monitor that usage over that period of time and see how your application reacts as it's flowing through there, and it'll collect all that telemetry, which is really a great way to kind of test your app. The other way you can test your app is like I did and just tweet out to a bunch of people and say, hey, I need somebody to test this URL, and hope that they respond. And hey, Hanselman, can you retweet that so I can get some traffic? So, I mean, there's a number of ways to test it, but this is great because now I'm testing it on the platform. I might be running this in like my staging slot. So you can choose the slot that you're running on. That way you're using the hardware. You're using somebody else's hardware to do it. I could run all kind of bash scripts from my machine, but I couldn't generate 2,500 people from my machine. I'm going to get socket exhaustion on my machine. I don't want to fire up a VM on Azure because that's going to be expensive that I'm going to have to pay for the VM. But now I can use a resource that I have here to run that test. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do that same similar thing is there is a DevOps project in here as well. If I go into the DevOps, I think it's performance. There's a DevOps way to do it as well with VSTS test and do the same type of thing, but there's another way to do it through DevOps. I like to do it with actually within the same application context and be able to set it up that way. So that's a really interesting way to test that. All right. Do I have 5 more minutes maybe? Does that sound right? Okay. The last thing I wanted to show was there's this neat little thing in the Azure CLI that we'll call it experimental. And let's see if I can get this bigger. Okay, so there's a couple of you that used the Azure CLI before, and I have created a quick app called, this is in my NDC Sydney test. So if I did a .NET run here, theoretically this should run just fine. It's thinking about it. I got a lot of things going on my machine right now. There we go. All right, so this is .NET 2.2.1 preview nightly build stuff. So this is the new templates. I can actually go to the Azure CLI. Is this big enough or need it bigger? Probably bigger, right? Okay. And the Azure CLI will allow you to do everything that you can do in the portal just through the command line. And we have this this great little thing called AZ Web App. If I do AZ Web App list, this will actually list all of the web applications. I need to do out table so you guys can see it. These are all of the web applications that I currently have running in my subscription. Just a few. In my subscription right now in Azure. So if I wanted to add a new one, I could go through the pane, if you will, of AZ Web App create and pass it a name of blah, whatever it is, and then also passing a resource group and doing all the things that we would have to do and create an app service and all that stuff that we have to do in the portal, but also do them here. And it's about 3 or 4 steps. So one of the things that we have started to build is an easy way to kind of fire things up using the Azure CLI to kind of get started. So we have this thing called AZ Web App Up. And all I have to do is pass it a name. I have to give it something funky. This is Sydney test. This will actually do all of those steps. It'll take the current folder that I'm in and create the resource group, create my app service plan, and then create the app. Zip up my actual application, and then publish it to app service and run it. And it knows that it's either .NET Core, .NET, Java, or a Node application, and run that for you. Is that cool? Do you guys want to keep working on that? Yeah? All right. So this actually takes it up there. It does the .NET Restore. It does the build. It does everything in Azure, and then does the publish on the Azure App Service. If I wanted to update the application, I just run AZ Web App up again, and it'll do the diff and stick it up there for us as well. All right, pretty cool. So if I went into the home, and we called it like this is test, so I just copy that, and I look at my resources. Don't look at my resources. I have a lot of resources. All resources. It's loading. It created my app service. Right, it's created my thing here. It's still currently doing its thing. But it created all that stuff for me. It took about 6 steps, and it did all in one little command line. Really great for just quick and dirty, make sure I can do my thing. So it's got my app services running. It's still doing the builds and things for us. So we're working on speed. We're working on things like that. But it was pretty fast. Okay. All right. So real quick, let's finish this out. Go. Who thought the slowest thing would be PowerPoint refreshing? Okay, so some quick resources. Docs.microsoft.com/Azure. You can go to just docs.com. If you don't have an Azure account, go to azure.com/free. .net for all our new stuff on ASP.NET Core and all things .NET. I can be reached at SP Boyer on Twitter. All of my friends that I work with on our advocates team are on at Azure Advocates. All of the fancy links for all the things that I talked about are on my GitHub, SP_Boyer_NDC Sydney on GitHub. I mentioned the Azure Advocates. We are a big team. This is our team. We're getting bigger by the day. If there's a technology that you're having a problem with working on Azure, this is the team that you want to talk to. And it's everything from Linux to .NET to Java to DevOps to Go to anything you can probably Python. So if there's something in the stack that you're having an issue with, whether it be Azure or microservices or anything on any cloud, we are here to make that better for you. So feel free to reach out to that handle or myself, and we'd be willing to help you out. There's probably some people on that picture you'd recognize other than the guy in the red shirt. So thank you, and if you have questions, I'll be available for you.